So Edge Studio sent me this starter set for their Arkham Horror RPG. There's a lot to unpack here, literally and figuratively. First, let's start off with what Arkham Horror is in the first place. It was originally a cooperative adventure board game designed by Richard Launius and published in 1987 by Chaosium. There was a second edition published in 2005 by Fantasy Flight Games, and then a third edition in 2018. I personally played the second edition a lot. A buddy of mine kept buying the expansions and we just kept playing it, blissfully ignorant of the fact that the game was notoriously badly designed. We weren't reading board game message boards much back then. And as much as that game kind of sucked, we played it for countless hours, basking in the admittedly amazing artwork and the slavish devotion to the theme of what I consider one of Lovecraft's top 3 stories, the Dunwich Horror. The Dunwich Horror is pretty much the only story that Lovecraft wrote where the protagonists actually identify the monstrous threat, prepare weapons and spells, go out to fight the threat, and, spoiler alert, defeat the threat. It was published in 1929, but actually tracks like a golden age 1950s sci-fi horror film. And Arkham Horror designer Richard Launius was a genius for trying to capture that magic in a board game. As you might imagine, Arkham Horror, the board game, sounds a lot like it could have been called Call of Cthulhu, the board game. I don't want things to get confusing here, even though Launius did in fact submit his original game to Chaosium with that very name. Call of Cthulhu is, and since 1981 has been, its own role-playing game, also published by Chaosium and originally designed by Sandy Petersen. It's based on Lovecraft's story of the same name, but has so many player options and possibilities that it goes way beyond anything that the protagonists experienced in the story. But at its heart, it's about supernatural investigation and facing the threat of physical and psychological harm in the process. The reason I'm explaining all this is because how is it that there is an Arkham Horror role-playing game? Arkham Horror as an intellectual property has expanded to other board games and card games and even novels at this point. But why a role-playing game when there is already the award-winning, internationally adored, critically acclaimed Call of Cthulhu, which at the time of recording is now in its 7th most glorious edition? Well, I'll cut to the chase here. Arkham Horror the RPG is the weirdest mix of board game and RPG I've ever encountered. At least from what I can get from the contents of this starter set box, it's the RPG version of a board game, not the RPG of a genre. I'll try to show you what I'm talking about, but first let's actually look at what's inside the box. I've got a lot of criticisms of this game, but I have to give credit where credit is due. Edge Studios has produced a physically very high quality product. The box itself is a sturdy full color job. By the way, this starter set box does not have the words starter set or starter box on the front or sides. It has the name of the starter scenario, Hungering Abyss. On the back, it identifies itself as a starter set in the second paragraph. I think this very seriously risks casual consumers mistaking this for a full game. It's most definitely not a full game. You can squeeze 4 to 5 hours of entertainment out of this product with a single group, and then it's kind of expended. But do note just how much printed material it comes with. It really is a lot of different papers you get to shuffle around. Always use a dull, decorative dagger to open this box so that you risk damaging the box and injuring yourself. First thing you'll see is the 48-page instruction and scenario manual. Check this out. The booklet is stitch bound. This is incredible, and I've never seen this done before. Stitch binding is always reserved for hardbound books and relatively deluxe ones or ones made at scale by larger publishers. You never see a 50-page booklet with this kind of quality binding, so that was impressive. Ironically, this is not a booklet that you'll be reading or using more than a few times, since again, the scenario only provides you with 1 or 2 sessions of play. By the way, from this point forward, I'm going to be spoiling the scenario, so if you plan on playing it, then please continue watching so that you know how all the clues fit together in your session and can look really smart to everyone else at the table. The booklet itself is printed on thick matte pages, full color of course. When you're working with anything from the Arkham Horror product line, you're going to see top-notch artwork and layout. These are all industry professionals doing this stuff. There are 5 character folios, all pre-generated, and containing the character's backstory, as well as mission-critical clues for solving the mystery of the scenario. All these pre-gens are from the Arkham Horror universe, so if you've played the board games or card games or read the novels, the names and caricature poses will look familiar to you. There are 4 letter-sized clue prop pages, all printed on deluxe thick paper, and players are meant to find these at certain points in the scenario to piece together what the hell's going on. The box also includes 3 double-sided maps, each with 1-inch grids. The paper is relatively thick and high quality, of course. Naturally, if they printed out a map, they intended to have a combat encounter there. So with 6 maps, you're looking at 6 possible planned combats in the scenario. There are a handful of other locations that aren't mapped and which serve the location of narrative encounters. Here we have a big sheet of tokens. Okay, this is where the game really diverges from any kind of normal RPG. Instead of using a pencil at all, except in one exception at the end of the scenario that is actually a typo, you're meant to always use tokens and cards for everything. Tokens for physical and mental damage, tokens to mark itemware, tokens for doom tracking, as well as cards for weapons, items, and spells. As you might imagine, the tokens are very thick, quality printed cardboard pieces, the kind you might expect to be included in a board game. But it's this relentless implementation of tokens and avoidance of writing absolutely anything down that struck me as odd. I have to go on another sidebar here and tell you what I spent 2 weeks of my life doing prior to making this video. Whoever owns the rights to Arkham Horror, whether it's Fantasy Flight Games or Edge Studio or whoever, licensed the rights to sculpt official Arkham Horror miniatures to one of my all-time favorite sculpting studios, Loot Studios out of Brazil. So when I was poring over this starter set, Loot Studios announced the release of all these official miniatures. Not just 1 or 2, but 3 sets of miniatures. Naturally, I bought all 3 sets right away and started cranking them out on my resin printer. But oddly, Loot Studio made all these miniatures 42mm scale instead of the standard 28mm. Since my preferred scale is 75mm, I had to resize each one and add custom supports and all that. But long story short, I printed out all the investigators for the entire first wave of Loot Studio Arkham Horror miniatures, as well as most of the monsters that are encountered in this starter set box. I like the sculpts. They're great. It's going to take me months to paint them all, but it's going to be fun. The 75mm scale, though, means that I can't use them on maps that use 1-inch grids. But whatever. This game's combat rules aren't very tactical anyway. But here's the actual most interesting thing about the Loot Studios models. Only one of their 3 sets, Feast for Ghouls, is associated with this Arkham Horror RPG starter set. Their other 2 model sets, King in Yellow and Crawling Chaos, have completely different investigators and monsters. Don't quote me on this, but I think these other 2 sets are connected to future starter boxes that Edge Studio plans to publish for this RPG, which is to say they plan on publishing at least 2 more starter boxes. My hope is that they release a core rulebook before they do that. Phew, anyway, back to the tokens in this box. You get tokens, they're double-sided, they're nice. Oh, and on to what I think is the low point in this box, the little puzzle pieces. At 2 different points in the scenario, players are expected to solve a little sliding square puzzle in order to either escape a fight or get a critical clue. Let me just tell you right now, this is awful. Don't ever make your players have to solve cheesy puzzles like this, ever. Just have them roll a lore check, or at most, a series of lore checks. And then you know what? Give them the clue whether they pass or fail the check, but if they fail, just tack on a complication to the scene. The box also comes with a nice 2-panel GM screen that contains tables not found in the instruction booklet. That was an interesting choice. In order to access 2 critical tables, one for traumas and one for injuries, you have to have open this very wide GM screen somewhere, and I'm not sure the designers wanted this to be a GM screen at all. In the booklet, they actually suggest laying this screen down flat on the table, which is perfectly fine since there are no hidden roles in this game or anything, but nothing says that this game is designed by board game people more than them asking you to lay the GM screen down flat on the table. Also, there's a pretty serious typo at the top of the trauma table. It says to determine a trauma, you roll 1d6 and add 1 for each existing injury. That's the rule for rolling injuries. For traumas, you roll a d6 and then add any 1s rolled with horror dice in the last roll that you made. Here's a box made of thin cardstock. They had me really excited for a couple seconds when I saw these boxes. I thought maybe they were actual stitched pleather with little metal buttons, but nah, it's just paper. In one box, you have 12 relatively smaller marbled green dice. They very much look and feel like generic board game dice. I think folks in the RPG community have gotten accustomed to much more visually interesting dice. and this was sort of another tell that this box set had some board game people making choices. The other box has 12 marbled gray dice. 24 dice actually isn't enough d6s to play the scenario, by the way, unless you keep the number of players down to maybe 2. Each player and NPC in an encounter needs 6 dice, and enemies require 3 or 4 dice each. So if you have 4 players and an NPC facing off against 4 ghouls, for example, you need something like 42 d6s to represent the health of every combatant. That being said, the starter sets that even include dice at all never include enough dice. But in the case of this game, which uses dice as health and ability indicators, as well as instruments that you roll to determine outcomes, it seems like a really gutting shortcoming. I feel really bad for the people who buy this box set thinking they're getting a full game, and 1, discover after the fact that they bought a one and done starter set, and 2, only have enough dice in the box to play with 2 other people. And you can't have Arkham Horror anything without cards. In this case, there are a few cards representing clues from a cop PC, and the rest of them are item cards. Like I mentioned earlier, you don't write anything down in this starter set. It's 100% playable with physical tokens, sheets, and cards. Well, you might need to provide more dice, but you will not need a pencil at all. On to the mechanics of this game. The 48-page booklet sort of teaches you the rules of this game in the course of presenting the scenario itself, so you will not be able to easily reference the rules you might have read in the course of reading through the scenario unless you bust out a highlighter and make some visual signposts. There's no table of contents or index, so it's really on you to finish Edge Studios' job of making a usable game manual for your session. Fortunately, the game's mechanics, at least presented in the starter set, are relatively simple. Actually, let's just walk through a quick combat that illustrates all of the main points of the resolution mechanics. Let's say that our hero, Private Eye Joe Diamond, is at his house tracking down clues when he's beset by a couple of flesh-eating ghouls. The moment a fight begins, the game goes from an unstructured scene to a so-called structured scene. This just means that all the PCs will do their movements and actions, and then all the enemies will do theirs. Health is represented by these 6 dice. It doesn't matter which face is up, but the color of the dice do matter. You start off with all gray or all of one color. If you start taking horror damage, you'll be replacing the gray dice with green dice. Now, if you're having a hard time seeing the difference between these colors, you're not alone. Edge Studio could have done a better job of contrasting the colors. I'm gonna go ahead and replace these tokens with my handy dandy 75mm sculpts from Loot Studios, because I can. And then let's say that Joe wants to shoot at one of the ghouls. To do that, the player would be rolling with their ranged combat. That's one of the 10 listed skills in the game, and Joe has a +4. The lower the better here. It means that no matter how many dice I choose to roll from my available pool, I need to roll a single 4 or above in order to succeed. So let me go ahead and expend 3 dice for this round. This pool will actually refill at the beginning of the next round, but I want to save a few dice to spend on reactions if the ghouls attack me on their turn. Boom, I got a success with this ranged combat roll. That's 2 damage with 1 pistol, but check this out. Every PC has special little rules depending on their weapons and abilities. For Joe Diamond, it's 2 pistol fighting, which basically gives me an extra die to roll when shooting both of my pistols. Bang, that's another success, for a total of 4 damage on 1 ghoul. Notice that the ghoul uses the same health dice pool system as the PCs, and in the case of their card here, which is out in the open for everyone at the table to see, the ghoul has no more dice because it took 4 damage and is dead. Let's skip forward to this other ghoul's turn. You have to read all of the special little abilities and conditions first. One feature that applies here is part of the pack. When 1 or more ghoul allies are within 15 feet of this ghoul, it may re-roll up to 2 dice when it uses its teeth and claws attack, but must keep the second result. As for teeth and claws attack, if it scores 3 or more successes, it inflicts an injury. So alright, as the GM, I want this ghoul to expend all 3 of its dice to attack Joe Diamond, using its melee skill of 4+. And that's 3 successes. Joe doesn't have any actual armor listed with any armor value, so none of this damage is reduced. As Joe, I will roll against my agility skill to see if I can dodge. and that's a fail. The ghoul actually doesn't even need to re-roll its dice for that part of the pack ability. It scored 3 successes, but those only count as 1 successful attack for a total of 2 damage. That's health damage, as noted by these tokens. So the next time I go to refill my dice at the beginning of the next turn, I only refill up to 4 dice. Because of teeth and claws, it does inflict an injury right away because the ghoul scored 3 or more successes. Injuries work by rolling a d6 and adding the number of existing injuries. Since Joe doesn't have any previous injuries, it's just the result of the d6 here. I look up the result on the table in the GM screen mat thing. Joe can eventually heal from an injury, but only in a narrative scene. All right, new round. He has 2 physical harms, so again, his dice pool only fills up to 4 for this round. Now, just for example's sake, this is not how it plays out in the published scenario. Let's say some monstrous tentacles burst out of the floor. Well, these particular tentacles have the ability Writhing Horror, which dictates that at the beginning of the GM's turn, any PC within 10 feet of these tentacles suffers 1 horror damage. Incidentally, there's nowhere in the rules that I saw where PCs can dodge or avoid incoming horror damage. When a PC takes that kind of damage, you put horror damage dice where normal dice would go. Then, when you go to roll for any action or reaction, you have to roll those horror dice first among the pool, and they act as normal dice to score successes. But if any horror dice come up as a 1, then you add those 1s to a d6 roll and check the trauma table on the GM mat screen thing. That's pretty much the gist of it. As you can see, most of the play options and variability come in the form of different special abilities, items, and spells that a character can have, but the underlying dice mechanics are very straightforward and very visual. I don't really want to walk you through the whole scenario, not because I'm worried about spoilers, but because I think we've spent enough time in this video discussing this product, but I do want to share with you my pros and cons of this scenario after a read through of it. And yes, there are spoilers here. Pros. It's a straightforward Arkham horror scenario. There's a missing person or 2, there are clues that bring you to a few locations, there are some encounters, and then a finale. Every pre-gen starts with a critical clue that they can add to the investigation. This kind of jump starts the story a bit, and hopefully gets things moving along. On the flip side of this, if no one in your party plays a given character, you as the GM have to shoehorn in the missing PC's default clue. And adding to this, the PC Joe Diamond is so integral to the mystery that if no one chooses to play Joe Diamond, the GM actually has to assume the role of Joe to make everything run smoothly. Cons. The slide puzzles are ridiculous. Just as a rule of thumb, don't foist Cracker Jack box puzzles on your players in any RPG at any time, but especially not during a combat encounter or as a means of obtaining a critical clue in a mystery scenario. I guess these puzzles made the package photo look fuller and more filled with dynamic content, but the production budget would have been better allocated towards more dice. Tiny tokens. Some of the tokens are large, some of the tokens are medium, but there are a bunch of these tiny centimeter wide tokens that you use to track ammo and gear damage and doom and injuries. These tokens are too small for me personally. Night Gaunts are a filler monster. You're meant to throw these creatures called Night Gaunts at players trying to get from one location to another, and they have absolutely nothing to do with the scenario, nor are they explained in any way. They're just annoying flying monsters meant to whittle down PC health, completely outside of the context of the story. Needs a town map. There are a generous 6 encounter maps that come in the box, and I appreciate that. But instead of a map of the woods, where there's actually no meaningful encounter, they missed an opportunity to instead give you a town map that contains the secondary locations that PCs can go to. It's kind of ironic that this starter set, which is pretty slavishly based on a board game, doesn't give you the board game style town map that makes it easy for players to visualize where they are and where they can go. These secondary locations I'm talking about only serve as single function locations, such as a place to buy spells or to talk to a particular NPC, but it would have given the whole scenario a much more cohesive feel. And that kind of segues into my overall thoughts about this game. I don't think I've ever seen a game that straddles the line between RPG and board game quite this much. I can understand why they wouldn't want you to need a pencil and paper to write anything down and just have everything tracked with dice, tokens, and cards, but I'm left wondering if that's how this whole product line will play itself out. Each new product being a closed ecosystem boxed set with ever more cards and tokens to amass, much the way that the Arkham Horror board game by Fantasy Flight Games was sold. Will this game ever debut as a fully fledged normal RPG where you can write things down and make characters from your own imagination? Or will it always be so tightly lashed to the board game on which it's based? I'd love to know your thoughts on this starter box, and if you've been able to get it to your table, leave your comments down below. Thanks as always for watching. See ya!